U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has lauded South Africa's partnership with the American government on energy transition. Yellen's visit comes as Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was in the country to solidify ties with Pretoria. Now, during her visit, she has stayed away from commenting about the planned joint military drills by South Africa, Russia and China. Yellen has, however, warned South Africa not to violate sanctions put by the U.S. government on Russia. Joining us now is Brooks Spector, who is an international relations expert. Brooks, thank you for making time for us this afternoon. We have been attracting a lot of diplomatic attention of late, all this attention from global players. What are you reading into this? Are we becoming a significant international player of sorts?
Well, good afternoon, Clemens, and good to talk to you and your audience. It's not so much that there has been a revolution in the circumstances of South Africa as much as international events are encouraging and in some cases forcing out other powers, other parties to find support, allies, and encouragement. Let's break it down slightly. I mean, the Russian visits actually, if you count Sergei Lavrov and the military naval exercise and a number of other comments, as well as South African visits to Russia. This comes at a time when Russia is increasingly isolated internationally with major nations because of its invasion of Ukraine. And so the Russian imperative is largely geopolitical or strategic, security related in its effort to shore up support on behalf of its current foreign policy. Trade's not a big factor in Russian and South African relations. It's an order of magnitude smaller than trade between the United States and South Africa. Turn toward the U.S. and the visit by Janet Yellen was a three-nation visit, and it came on the back of a summit between African leaders and U.S. President Joe Biden last year, December, which was and is obviously now an ongoing effort to reset a relationship with the continent that had been so badly abused in the previous administration. And in effect, it's a reach back to the way the Obama administration tried to set out its connections and its relationship with the continent. Much of the U.S.-Africa, U.S.-South African relation focuses on economic and trade issues because, as you were highlighting in your intro, Janet Yellen made a point of noting that there are well over 600 U.S. companies involved in Africa, either as direct investments or smaller companies or very large ones or franchise operations, the whole gamut. And many people, many scholars, many experts note that the African middle class and aspirant middle class population is growing dramatically, and especially the young people in Africa. And those are people who are of prime interest to companies and countries that produce goods and services. Not so many people are desperate on this continent to buy Russian goods or Russian services, but I think you'd find pretty much everybody who has any money is keen to get a hold of some aspect of American output.
All right.
The Chinese, on the other hand, are largely focused on trade, investment, and lending as opposed to geopolitical questions.
Okay. Let's maybe zoom in. Let's zoom in into Russia a little bit now. You are saying that the country has been shunned by many countries as a result of its war in Ukraine. So it could do with some friends. But how much of good friends are we as South Africa being to Russia when we have rarely taken a position as South Africa to be neutral, and Russia would rather have us say, this is the position we take and we stand with you as our BRICS brother?
Well, I would argue that although the words neutral come up and come out of the mouths of South African politicians, the acts of South African government activities and related things do not speak to neutrality. They speak to an increasingly one-sided position. This military exercise, this naval exercise that's going to take place off the KZN coast next month, happens to be taking place precisely on the date that the Russians invaded Ukraine. And for people who look for symbolic content, that's a pretty serious symbol of an alignment, if not in word, but certainly in deed.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that that visit may also have something to do with the upcoming BRICS summit?
Which visit? Sorry.
Russia's visit, the foreign minister's visit here. May that have something to do with the meeting, the BRICS meeting that's also upcoming later on?
Well, I'm sure it's part of it is consultations on that.
Yeah.
Plus this year, South Africa is the chair and the host. But I would issue one note of caution. Of all the countries that constitute that alignment, South Africa seems to be the only one that takes BRICS as a concept seriously enough to actually pin their foreign policy activities on it. You notice there's very little coming out of the mouths of Indian leaders or Brazilian leaders about BRICS as a notion. The Chinese have other approaches, the Shanghai Cooperation Council and the Belt and Road Initiative with, I think, collectively between the two efforts, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 45 countries. And I think that's where they're putting their primary focus. The Russians at this point are, I hesitate to say this, but I think they're really trying to put some Band-Aids on some serious cuts.
Yeah. And in terms of how Pretoria received both the guests, how did you read that? Both the foreign minister from Russia and this U.S. Secretary of Treasury?
Well, I think they gave Janet Yellen a polite and respectful response. She is a very senior official in the U.S. government. The Treasury Department and the State Department and the Pentagon are the three most important cabinet offices, and Janet Yellen is a respected economist and scholar, even outside of government efforts. I think that, however, sadly, from my perspective, they gave far too much of a warm embrace to Mr. Lavrov's mission and message, and there wasn't in any of the public statements that I saw even a hint of saying you really should not have engaged in a war against your neighbor. That would have been an important symbol had they done it, but sadly they did not.
Mm-hmm. And if we just go back to China, you've indicated that they will be taking part in these military drills. It looks like they've been hush-hush on that. How significant is that?
I speculated the other day in something I wrote that the Chinese see this effort, I think, more in terms of being able to watch very closely the quality and effectiveness of Russian long-range naval operations rather than a full-hearted participation in a tripart naval exercise. Because, we can tend to forget it, but the Russians and the Chinese have their own competitive impulses and their own competitions on a number of issues. And I do think the Chinese do not at this point see Russia as essentially as an equal, but more as a large supplier of petroleum and natural gas products and some other strategic minerals and metals, much more than a major strategic partner. So I think in this sense, the Chinese are participating in this to gauge the ability of Russia as as a nation with naval ambitions and opportunities. Because the Chinese are, of course, spending a great deal of time and energy building up their own naval capabilities, mostly focused on the Pacific, of course, Pacific Ocean.
Yeah. Brooks Spector, international relations expert, thank you for joining us this afternoon.